We start with breaking news. The latest GDP figures are in. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, is in our central London studio. Ed, what can you tell us?
Yeah, the economy contracted. Sorry, I should say it grew by 0.3%. It's a contraction in comparison with what it was previously. So 0.3% growth in the first quarter of the year. A fall from the growth rate that was previously for the previous quarter, 0.7% in the previous quarter, and actually a little bit weaker than many economists had expected. They expected it to go down to about 0.4%. So 0.3% is weaker than that. Nonetheless, it is the weakest since the referendum. It actually was a bit weaker in the first quarter of last year, 0.2%. So, some people would look at this and say that this is within the range that it bounces around at. But nonetheless, it does suggest that the economy is starting somewhat to slow down. It was 0.7% the previous quarter before that, it was 0.5%. So a weaker economic growth rate than had been expected. And let's remind ourselves of what GDP is. Essentially, it is the total amount of income generated by the UK economy in that period. And we just look at the growth rate and work out how that implies the economy is doing. And it means that the UK economy is growing its income a little bit less quickly than had been previously thought. Looking at the annual rate, that's down to 2.1%. The expectation had been that would be 2.2%. We're talking not here about anything like the kind of recession that some economists had expected after the UK voted for Brexit. The economy remains, even on the basis of these slightly weaker numbers, it remains robust and it remains relatively stable. But some people might look at this and they might say, well, the economy isn't necessarily powering ahead quite as fast as it was before. Might this be because people are starting to slow down their spending? And when you look through the detail, what we've seen over the course of the last few months is that retail sales, for instance, have started to slow down. The services sector, which has generated most of the growth in the UK economy, that had been powering ahead, but that started to slow a little bit as well. And while people have been borrowing quite a lot to finance their spending, the amount of borrowing that they're doing is starting to drop slightly as well. So there you can see it. So 0.3% in the first quarter of this year. Worth saying, though, if you kind of looked back one extra quarter beyond that, you'd see a 0.2% in the first quarter of last year. It does seem as if the first quarter of the year recently has been weaker than the rest, but a weaker number than had been expected by economists. And some people will look at that and say, well, is this the start of the Brexit effect starting to take hold? I think in practice, actually, it'll take a little bit longer before we actually know whether this is down to Brexit or indeed other factors, but weaker growth than expected.
OK, Ed, thank you very much for that update, that breaking news that GDP, the economy growth, 0.3%. That's the first quarter of 2017. So those figures might frame the debate in the election campaign today. But is the economy the issue that's being ignored in this campaign? Joining us now, two men very familiar with the tactics of political campaigning. Former advisor to David Cameron, Phillip Blond, he joins us from Westminster. And in Brighton, the former advisor to Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, Sam Tarry. Welcome to you both. You will, of course, have heard those figures just coming in to us with Ed Conway there. 0.3%. Perhaps showing that the economy is weakening down further than really predicted by most economists. If I can put that to you first, Phillip Blond.
Well, I think people have been predicting that with the uncertainties of Brexit, you might see a reduction in consumer spending and also business investment. But I think it's within a range of indicators, so I don't think that it really should alter our sense that the British economy has actually been much more resilient and robust than the post-Brexit scenarios that had been painted. I think the real question, and I think you're right that the economy has really been relatively ignored. The real question is how do we prepare for what's coming? What sort of Britain do we want? And what are the problems that we have in Britain? So, for instance, according to some estimates, by 2025, 1 in 5 jobs currently in the UK will be automated. And that doesn't even include things like driverless cars. So just as Philip Hammond spoke about the need to prepare for the future, that's really the debate we need to have. What sort of skills do we need? Regardless of government, we've had very poor long-term technical education in our country, and our people are not prepared for the future that that's going to come upon them post-Brexit. And that's really where I think the debate needs to go.
Sam Tarry, the problem is that we don't know what Brexit is going to bring entirely. These are all projections, and nobody knows exactly how they can be interpreted.
Yeah, well, look, one thing we know already, the figures produced by the TUC today have said that by 2022, 40% of all GDP will be in London and the South East. Now that, in my view, is a huge failure of the last few years of Conservative government. The talk of rebalancing the economy, the northern powerhouse, I mean, these are places which are going to be a real battleground in this election. And now the TUC have come out and said these figures, and it was, I think, 37.5% growth up to 2015 for GDP, just completely failed to rebalance the economy. And I think, why is that important? Because actually, linked with Brexit, if we don't get the right kind of deal, then we are going to be in serious trouble, and that ability to rebalance the economy is going to be even more difficult. And I actually agree with Philip Blond. There are huge challenges, automation being one of those, but one of the things that's on the table for this election is, what does a post-Brexit Britain look like? And I think Labour have been very, very clear in saying, look, we want a people's Brexit. That means we're going to invest, serious investment, strategic investment that is in high-skilled, high-wage, decent jobs. That means reinvesting into our manufacturing industry and the green technologies of the future, because it's those kinds of jobs which are, in a post-Brexit situation, going to help rebalance our economy, reinvesting in parts of the north. You know, for example, going ahead, pushing ahead, Labour are going to be very clear, I think, on high-speed rail. We may see something on sort of high-speed 3 potentially in the manifesto as well, because actually it's that long-term investment that is going to safeguard our economy. And I think it's really worrying, actually, that the growth has been so weak, as you just said, 0.3%, and that's highly troubling. I think a lot of big global organisations are looking at the UK and saying, perhaps now we're not certain, you know, the Tories don't really have a serious plan for what post-Brexit Britain looks like. And I think this is where Labour should really come into its own. We need to link the day-to-day bread and butter issues. How much money do you have in your pocket? How much and what type of education do you want? How do we pay for that? And I think the key thing for me is that all of the suggestions that are coming out of the Conservative Party at the moment, you know, things like grammar schools, you know, that drive for a hard Brexit, in which quite clearly there are people lobbying at a senior level in the Conservative Party to pretty much trash workers' rights. And I think that's just not going to be acceptable to the British people. So I think this election is going to be really key.
If I can just bring Philip Blond back in here. Might this be interpreted as the start of the Brexit effect, that people are seeing the initial effects on their household incomes? Or they're saying that things are more expensive in the shops already, and we haven't actually even Brexited as yet?
Well, it's just too early to tell. I mean, it might be the beginning of a long-term first quarter of the year effect. As Ed Conway spoke, I think it's really silly to read very much into such tiny movements within still a range that is growing. But just to speak to what Sam was pointing out, look, it's just stupid partisan politics to pretend that somehow the imbalance in the north has just emerged because of the Tory government. That's infantile. That's nonsense. The north has been declining relative to the south, arguably since before the Second World War. Now, actually, one has to, from an objective point of view, acknowledge that it's the Conservative government that came up with the Northern Powerhouse. The Labour Party, whose bastions have been the North, had never came up with any branding, any offer for the North. And moreover, it was us at Res Publica who wrote the original Devo Manc plan for devolution, and it was the Conservative government that delivered city devolution. So you've actually had massive Conservative policy innovation around the North, trying to drive investment, and again, it's the Conservative Party that that are driving through HS3. I believe that we've had a long-term structural abandonment of the North. If you look, for instance, at OECD figures, the North is 48% below infrastructure averages for the North, and that's under parties of both left and right. And if you're asking which party is it that's recognised that there's an issue in the North, I'm afraid it's the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party are Johnny-come-latelys on this. But I'm glad they're in the same... I'm glad they're with us.
Labour's done nothing for the North.
I don't think it's infantile to point out that, hospitals are a breaking point because of the cuts to sort of social welfare programmes and local government. Lots of the public sector has been absolutely hammered by the cuts. People are kind of recognising it's going too far, it's having a negative knock-on impact. There's been no serious long-term investment strategy, whether it's in ports, whether it's in rail. HS2 is something that was started, and planned by Labour. It just seems to me that, this idea that Labour is not prepared to rebalance the economy, the Conservatives are not putting forward any serious solutions that are about long-term investment. Labour have announced that we will put in place a national investment bank. The last green investment bank that the Conservatives had, they just privatised it. It seems to me that we need to be really focused on actually saying, look, it's not acceptable that by 2022, 40% of all GDP will be in London and the South East. If we're serious about rebalancing this country, Labour's plans that we're putting forward, which are fully costed, that are sensible, that are about investment in the manufacturing industries, that are about investment in new high-skilled jobs, investment in the defence industries, and our commitments on things like Trident and investing into defence in places like Hull with the BAE Systems plant at Brough. It seems to me really quite clear that there is a choice at this election, a choice between investment that's going to put people into work, but not on 0 hours contracts, low-paid, insecure jobs. The Tories turn around and say it's a success that we've got nearly 1 million people that are self-employed. Well, that would be a success if most of those people were paid decent wages and had pensions and security, but most of them don't. They've been forced into that choice. And I think that is utterly unacceptable. And I think the British people will look at this and say, look, we've got a choice here. We want investment into our communities. We've had a government that has maliciously slashed budgets in local government right across the country that has actually not done regeneration. Labour's record in government in the 1990s and 2000s was huge.
Philip Blond, I must bring Philip Blond back in. You've admirably defended Labour's record on really coming up with ideas to regenerate the North. Do you accept those, Philip Blond?
I just think I'm not intending this as some sort of party political broadcast, which I'm afraid is what we've heard. I've said the North has suffered since before the Second World War relative decline. And I think it's fair and objectively true to say that the only party recently that has tried to revive the North has been the Conservative Party. Now, in terms of things like, inveighing against the government for cuts, what we've actually now created is an investment environment. The deficit has been taken down from somewhere just under 10% back in 2010 to just under 3%. That's massive. That's created the capacity for us to invest at scale. And I do believe we need to invest in scale. And I do believe that we are going to see that in the Conservative manifesto around schooling, around infrastructure, and around transport. And remember, once again, it's this government that set up the National Infrastructure Commission to actually assess what type of investments we need, what's the best way to spend our money to get the growth that we need. So I think that the ask we should make, regardless of what your politics are what is the offer from the government to meet our problems. We need to outline our problems. We need, for instance, long-term technical through-life training. If we're going to have lots of people losing their jobs, which we are because of automation and robotics, we need a way to retrain them. We need a way in which people can have some investment, some package whereby they can, at the age of 40, 50, 60, go and retrain. This is what the debate we need to have about the problems we face in the future, and we need to ask, the parties to come up with that, rather than have some sort of party political debate that really isn't isn't accurate or true.
OK, just time for one more question. Sam Terry, I just wanted to ask you about your not being chosen as the Labour candidate for Hullen West and Hessel seat, Alan Johnson's old seat. You're obviously a former Corbyn advisor. Should we read into this that the party is moving away from that left of centre politics, away from the Corbynistas as they've been described?
No, we've got an absolutely brilliant local candidate there who's going to be absolutely superb. I was very honoured to even get the chance to put my name forward for consideration.
But why do you think
I'll
you
be
weren't
looking
chosen?
forward to go out.
Why do you think you weren't chosen?
I've no idea at all. I think we decided that what was best for the party was a local candidate in that particular situation.
OK. Sam Terry and Phillip Blond, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, to our main news story on